Welcome to another episode of. Actually, we have a title now. It's called Folklore. That was
Aha.
that was either someone in the comments who said folklore or Sean Tomlin who said folklore, but I don't know which one was copying off of each other or who said it first. So they can fight among themselves. But that is the title we're going with. And so I have Jason Farley with me in his studio home.
my 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 home studio. I guess it's my studio home too, since I live in my studio. That is.
Yeah, try turn your volume up a little bit, I think.
I will try.
Or that could be me.
Is that better?
And then, yeah, and then of course with us is world famous, amazing animator, one of my heroes. Worked on Dexter's Laboratory, Powerpuff Girls, Ren and Stimpy, and the creator of Loud House, Chris Savino, and he's on our advisory board for Lore, working with animators, and it's just I'm amazed every day.
Most importantly, yeah. Thanks for having me. Good to see you guys. It's been a while, right?
It has been a while. Yeah, I think it's been some time, but it's really great to have you on here. Jason, why don't you start out? Just let people know sort of Chris Savino, the billion-dollar IPs he's worked on, and just why he's just incredible.
Hey, before you start, can I just say to Marcus, congratulations on the path to being future parents. I think God bless you all. I think it's amazing.
I have my baby lover and abortion now shirt on. But I'm
so happy for you guys. You're getting closer and closer, and you're going to make great parents.
Yeah. It's we've been, I think, for about a year now. We've just been raising to hit a certain goal, and we've reached that goal, and so now we can basically start the process. That's a whole nother podcast.
Exciting and scary. God's
talking
timing.
About cartoons, man. But yeah, we're going to start adoption. So
hey, you're making you're adopting a future cartoon watcher. So
that's true. I was thinking about that the other day. Actually, that's a great point. I was thinking about that. I was like going through Paramount, and I saw the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was like, man, it'd be cool to have a son to watch the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But I'll watch it by myself until then. But yeah, Jason, so go ahead and
yeah, well, as a parent of now a number of grown children, even and even one married child, some of my favorite memories were the times we sat around and watched cartoons, watched some of the ones that we've rewatched a number of times, Avatar: The Last Airbender, the Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, some of those that our family still quotes, but in there are things like the Powerpuff Girls, and Dexter's Laboratory was a little bit before their times, although I will often quote Dexter's Laboratory to them and they don't get it.
Oh boy.
But one of the things that is important about cartoons is that it really does end up kind of giving vocabulary to your life and to your family and all sorts of things. I will regularly say it's log, it's better than bad, it's good, right, to my kids, and they're like, oh, Dad's always quoting Ren and Stimpy. And then to have gotten to meet you and spend time talking about story and reading your book on 4-panel structure and the way that you think about story, it makes so much sense that so many of the really important cartoons for myself and for my family and for my kids had that kind of thought put behind them, and so I always enjoy connecting and talking and all of the things. And I had actually not ever seen Loud House until we met, and so then I went and binged the whole thing.
Oh boy.
Which was
a lot.
It really was. But it's amazing, the consistency of Loud House, I think, was what surprised me, because in the era of binging, they had to actually shorten the seasons to be able to get the kind of consistency that, you can do 8 episodes really well versus 30 episodes when you've got a week between them.
Sure.
You can repeat, you don't have to have kind of the level of consistency. So, I mean, one of the questions that I had is, where did Loud House come from as a concept, as an idea? And then from concept to implementation, were there any like big major changes that ended up getting made?
Well, it's a good question, that second one, and I'll get to that. I just happened to say God's timing when we were talking about the length of time to raise the money for your adoption. And now as a Christian, I look back and it was God's timing. I was fortunate to work as my first job on Ren and Stimpy. I was fortunate to work on Dexter's Lab and Powerpuff Girls and be offered those positions from people who trusted me to not only work on their show, but also to helm it at some point later on. And, in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a frustration that was growing of like, when am I going to get my chance? I'm working with these really talented people who are on second and third and almost fourth series. Is like, when am I going to get my chance? And it wasn't until the Loud House actually happened that I realized, looking back, I wasn't fortunate. It was God's timing. He was putting me in a place to where that would happen. And it wasn't, it's about time when I got it. It was, oh, this is the right time. Because I feel like I couldn't have done the Loud House 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier because I didn't know enough yet. I knew enough about how to make a show, and I was gathering ideas about how to not make a show. And all of those things culminated in a show that does have that consistency, the things that that you want in a cartoon. Who knows what makes a hit cartoon? Nobody. But if you're authentic and you're honest with what you're making, that will come through. And I think kids and adults recognize that. They know when they're being pandered to, and they know when they're watching something that has real authenticity behind it. And I don't mean authentic in the sense of, hey, I'm a truck driver and I made a cartoon about truck drive and there's authenticity in it. Granted, Loud House is about a big family and I'm from a family of 10 kids. That authenticity does come through, but it's not the kind of authenticity that I'm speaking of. I'm speaking of, and I'm going to answer your question, when you're in a position where executives are looking at what's in the zeitgeist, like, oh, that show over there is doing well. Let's make something like that. When those words are spoken, it's already too late. Cats are big right now.
That's the only word that's being spoken nowadays, though.
Correct. But, like, cats are big right now. Let's make a show about cats. It's like, well, making a show takes about 1.5 years, 2 years to actually get to air from the moment you speak it into existence. And by then it's too late. So if you're constantly chasing the trend, you're never going to catch up. You have to be the trendsetter. At the very least, you don't know you're going to be a trendsetter. You hope that you're going to be. I remember one time somebody on the crew was kind of lamenting, like, what if the show is a failure on the Loud House? And I was like, well, conversely, what if it's a success? Like, we have to deal with that success. And fortunately, it has been, and we've dealt with it. But so as far as the Loud House was concerned, when I pitched the show at Nickelodeon as part of my overall deal there, it was, at the time, it was about a rabbit, a boy bunny who had 25 sisters. And kind of the joke in that was like, rabbits multiply, so he's got all these sisters. And it was like, what do you do in this den of chaos? And I had worked on a bunch of shows that were human related. And I remember when I pitched it, I said, I just don't want to do human shows. There's too many limitations on that. I want to have fun and be cartoony and have characters go through walls and leave character-shaped holes and all of that. And it was developing good. I think the executives at Nickelodeon saw its potential for story, because that's what's most important. Like, what is the story engine, the thing that kind of keeps generating ideas that you don't run out of? And I remember clearly one day we had a particularly good meeting about the show. And on the way out, the the executive, just kind of as an aside, as we were all walking out, kind of shooting the breeze, she said, just do me a favor and consider making them human. And in my brain, I'm exploding like, that's the thing I didn't want to do. And I walked from her office downstairs to my office. And by the time that I got there, I realized she was right. And I sat down at my desk at that moment. And I'm not like reverse making up a story like to make it sound good. This is exactly how it happened. I brought up the rabbit design and I started changing the design to be a boy character. And I'll tell you that as soon as I decided that like that was going to be it, like it was going to be human, speaking of authenticity, it was like I wasn't even drawing from my life at that point. I was just like, it's funny that there's a boy rabbit with all these sisters. It's going to be chaos. But as soon as I did that, things from my life as a child growing up started making their way into it. And it was building on that. And I realized that I hadn't been doing that. And the more I drew, the more I designed the sisters to be human and not bunny rabbits, it started to fall into place. So much so, like, I have 5 sisters, and their names all start with L, and they all have 4 letters, and they're all middle named Marie. I'm like, well, I'm going to name 5 of these sisters from my sisters, because there it is. And then I had to come up with 5 more, and I had L names in my life that I used, pets and etc. And their middle names are all Marie. And, I'm thinking like, well, now what's the boy's name going to be? They're all L's, and I'm thinking Lancelot and Lenny, like all different kinds of names. And I realized, oh, I grew up on a street named Lincoln. I'm going to name him Lincoln. So it was just like somebody opened the doors and said, here's all your ideas, man. It's already in your brain. You don't have to think of anything. And I kid you not, it just seemed like every single decision that was made was the right decision from that point on. Not just me, everybody involved. I mean, I was working with this gentleman who was a writer. He was helping me on the short to write stuff. And he sat down and he goes, well, I'm assuming their last name is Loud, right? Because that was the name of the show, was Loud House. It was always that. And like a smack in the face, I'm like, well, it is now. I had no idea that was their last name. But it was just like everybody who brought their ideas in, it just seemed to make sense. And it was just growing like authentically from there. And I think that change, that openness to realize that somebody's suggestion was the right suggestion and not having an ego enough to go, nope, I said I didn't want to do it. Which, it happens.
Were there any suggestions you didn't want to do?
Yeah, there was a time where it was, once they became humans, it was like, well, does it have to be 10 sisters? Can you have some brothers? And I think part of, pitching a show and developing a show is having your answers and not being like pig-headed about it, but having an answer is like, well, the answer is no, and here's why. And the executive was like, that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, because it would make Lincoln not unique in the show. Besides his white hair, like, what is it? It's easy to go boy against girls and see that kind of dichotomy there. But if there's boy against some boys and girls, it just kind of gets it into a gray area. That was part of the conversation. She was, open to hear that. And went, yeah, you're right. And it stayed that way. I'm sure there were others, but I feel like as soon as it became humans and everybody who was involved with it, I tried to instill in them the idea that, no, this isn't my life as a cartoon. It's the idea of like what it's like to grow up in this big family. And we've all got stories like, oh, I remember when I was a kid, this happened, or when I was a kid, this happened. And it was open to be like, oh, that would make a great story. Can we use that? And that authenticity not only came from me, but it came from the head writer or the art director. They all started to kind of put their experiences into the cartoon. And I feel like had they not had that freedom or felt that they could do that and have some ownership in what they were contributing to the show, it would have probably fallen flat. But there's a sense in that, like when you see an episode and there's a scene that happens, you're like, there's no way somebody made that up. They must have experienced that because it just feels like it happened.
Right.
And it built from there.
And I think that's what gives it's so grounded without not being a cartoon ever, right?
Right.
And I think it must have been those stories from real life
Yep.
that grounds it.
It's exactly that. And, you know, anytime somebody came in and said, well, I've had this thing happen to me, it's like, let's listen. And it could be a scene, it could be a whole story, it didn't matter. And I feel like,
Yeah.
you know, as an aside, anybody who contributed in that way and then saw that play out, like come to fruition in an episode, like they had that bragging right. Like, oh, that's,
Right.
I contributed that to that story. Like, yeah, you own that now. That's that's your piece of this whole. It's not necessarily, yeah, the show filters through one point of view, but everybody gets to contribute in that respect. And
Do you feel like the executives at Nickelodeon were a lot more collaborative with their creators than other networks? Because you mentioned that you took a lot of their ideas. A lot of their ideas were good, and then but you also hear stories of just executives just destroying an IP.
Sure. There's this fear, I think. I mean, we're all afraid to say yes to something and to get behind something, and it has nothing to do with right or wrong. I mean, even a broken clock is right twice a day. But if you say yes, you're on the hook. If an executive happens to say, well, what about this idea? And then you go, oh, okay, because you're desperate to sell a show and you make that change and it just destroys the idea, well, they're on the hook for it. So you want to
Right.
make sure that, you know, but they also want to feel like they're contributing. That's their job, is to kind of, you know, develop. That's a development executive. That is their role. It is your job as the creator to present something in a way that you have a confidence in, not a cockiness, there's a difference, but a confidence in presenting your ideas and that your ideas can work. And when they have questions like, can there be other brothers? You have an answer for them, not like I'm stomping my foot and saying no. It's like, I hear what you're saying, but here's why it won't work and here's why it will work. That's not to say that they can't have great ideas, because they do.
Right.
But oftentimes there's not just one executive. There are many, and they've all got ideas and they all want to contribute and they all want to make the best show. It's like you get that response sometimes. It's like, well, we just want to make sure the show is good. Like, well, yeah, we all do. None of us are setting out to make sure the show is terrible.
Right.
So they want to contribute, and you want to contribute them to contribute as well. But sometimes when you know something so well, it's then your job to convince them why your idea is going to work. And
Yeah, that's the same with any job, right? Like it's like, well, why'd you hire me? If you don't trust me to do the work.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I feel like, again, God's timing. I'd been in the industry for so long at that point, 20 some years, that there was a sense, and even spoken out loud, of like, you know, we were all making shorts. There were like 12 or 15 people making shorts, and they had to wrangle all of these people, all making them at the same time. There was a sense of like, oh, well, Chris is experienced, just leave him be and we'll kind of check in. And I'm not saying it's because of that freedom somehow the show succeeded. I'm just saying I was fortunate enough to have had a good reputation to get a job done and do it right and not need hand holding or any of that. And I am the first person, if I like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Does anybody have any ideas? Like, I'm open to that. So I think they know if I was having issue, I would come and ask, like, hey,
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. I wouldn't have asked if they should be human, but somebody said it, and I give her credit to this day. Like, this is why the show succeeded, is that thing.
Yeah. Is as you worked on all of those different shows and saw what was working and what wasn't working, and what level of did you gain that confidence through through reflecting back on what worked and what didn't work, or is it something that you just internalized as you went along?
There were some mental notes taken, for sure. Some things you don't want to say out loud. Or as, like, let's just say the storyboard team all talking about the showrunner who's being a jerk. Like, we will talk about that person. And in my brain, I'm like, well, gosh, if I ever sell a show, I don't want people talking about me that way. I won't do that thing because I see how it affects these people. I think there is something to be said, having worked up the ladder and not skipped any steps, starting as like an assistant and working my way up to directing or storyboarding and all that, it does help to understand that the job that you're asking people to do for you, you understand what it takes to do that job. I understand what it takes to do background designs. I know that background design is better than me because I am not good at drawing backgrounds, but at least I can convey what it is that I'm looking for from them and understand what it takes to get that. Like, I'm not going to say design me a circus in an hour because I need it. It's like, I know it's going to take a while. What's realistic here? How can we get what we're looking for? And I think that helps a lot is knowing what everybody's role is, whether you're excellent at it or not. And I didn't mean to point at myself when I said excellent. But it's good to know those things. And I think that goes with every business or whatever. Some people seem to think that it's better to not know what it takes. That way you can demand these things of the people who are good at it. And I just don't agree with that. I've experienced it. I've seen people who work that way. I know what people say about those people after the fact. And it's like, no, I'm going to do it the opposite way. And it seems to have worked.
Yeah. Well, let's go back in time a little bit. Because you said you started on Ren and Stimpy, which is probably one of the most popular cartoons of one of them of all time. But how did you what got you into animation? What cartoons do you remember as a kid that was you watched that was like, this is what I want to do? How did you
Right.
get to Ren and Stimpy? Because I mean that's a pretty big deal first kick. Looking back, it is. No one probably knew at
It
the time.
is. And just to, as an aside, like, I will always give credit to John Christopher Lucy for giving me an opportunity. Some punk kid from Michigan who sent him a letter and a drawing. Like, this was like 1991. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have email. We had none of that. And it was, again, one of those things that you experience where, like, I'm going to do that thing. And I feel like, and I hope that I've given a lot of people their first opportunities, whether they appreciate it later in life or don't. You don't even have to acknowledge that I did. Just remember and pay it forward. Know what it was like to have somebody say, well, yeah, I'll give you a shot. And then it's up to you after that. But anyway, so not to go back in the 1980s, but back in the 1980s, I think it was TBS, I want to say, had started playing Warner Brothers shorts, the Looney Tunes, which I was aware of, but they were playing them every day now, and like an hour block, and you just got like loads of them. And it wasn't until high school, like late in high school, I always wanted to do comic strips. That was my passion. That was the thing that I learned to draw on. Not that I didn't watch cartoons. Rocky and Bullwinkle, Underdog, Popeye, Kimba the White Lion. Those were all my childhood cartoon watching experiences. But as far as drawing, it was comic strips. That's what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until late high school when I started watching these cartoons that I realized that it was a job. Like, people make these. I've forgotten. And the 1980s wasn't like overly amazing as far as cartoons go. There was the problem with cartoon commercials selling toys. But the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse had come out in, I think, 88, maybe 89, I'm not sure. And I was just like smitten with it. It was like, wow, this is a TV cartoon. I know what their limitations are, and I know like how different this is, how awesome it is. And as a kid, you could look up as much as you can at the local library and find out who's making it. You pause the tape to see who's directing them and writing them. And in 1990, there was an animation festival at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the pilot cartoon of Ren and Stimpy called Big House Blues was part of it. I'm like, well, I want to see that because I recognize the names from Mighty Mouse. And I saw it, and it just kind of blew me away. I got to do something. Again, being from a big family, I wasn't going to university. I wasn't affording that. I didn't think I was talented enough to get into something like CalArts. And so I typed a letter on a real typewriter to John Kay. I got the address. No. Let me back up a little bit. It wasn't. I saw that. I loved it. It was like a few months later that I saw a blurb in Animation Magazine, which I was a subscriber of. Somehow I thought that would make me a cartoonist, or at least professional. And there was a blurb in it that said Nickelodeon Studios is going to produce John Kricfalusi's Ren and Stimpy at his Spumco Studios on Melrose in Hollywood. That is pretty much all it said. And so I'm like, I want to work on this. I got to work on this. And I went to the library. I looked up Spumco, which was in the phone book. They had Los Angeles. And so I wrote him a letter and then put a drawing in it and sent it to him. And this is snail mail, right? You never know if it's going to make it. We have so much technology to know that somebody's opened our email. And it was like 2 weeks later, I got an actual phone call on the phone from John Kay saying like, oh, we saw your drawing. It was really good. We see some potential here. We don't want to see your finished drawings. Can you send us some of your sketches? And I'm like, yeah, let me get those in the mail for you. And I say this all the time. It's like I can't wait for the mail. So I did this new thing called faxing. I went to the local office supply shop, and they charged you for faxing. It was like 10 cents a copy. And I pulled pages out of my sketchbooks and faxed them over to him. And I want to say just 2 days later, he's like, oh, we saw your sketches. We really liked them. You got a job for $500 a week if you want to come out to LA. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. And even talking about it, like, I can't believe it. Like, a kid from Michigan, I'm talking to this guy who's like my hero as a cartoon maker, and he's offering me a job of $500 in 1991. I'm like, that was gold. So I said, just give me a few weeks. Because I had to drive out there, and I will come out there. So it was like April of 91, got in the car, drove, broke down in Denver, had to fly the rest of the way, and got to LA, I think in April, I want to say 19th, 1991, and started working the very next day. And I got to say, working on Recipe was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. But we don't need to get into that. Suffice it to say, I learned a lot in that short period of time working on that show.
Yeah. I guess my question is, because you hear old stories like that all the time of that sort of collaboration that takes place. One comes to mind is Carol Burnett and Vicki Lawrence.
Yeah.
Right. That's probably one of the most famous ones where, Carol Burnett called Vicki Lawrence and offered her a job after she emailed her. I'm not emailed, but
yeah,
but she sent a letter or something along those lines. And you hear that stuff. Do you think that happens less now, or I guess especially in the on the more conservative side of filmmaking, it seems way more secluded and gatekept, and I'm sure that's Hollywood too.
sure.
But it seems like there's less collaboration and seeking of young talent, and a lot of reusing, which seems like a way to reduce risk. But I think it actually stagnates. What are your thoughts on that sort of?
To be honest with you, I feel like the way that I did it, I feel like, what are the chances? What are the odds that he would see my letter, let alone like what he saw, let alone offer me work? And I think about kids today and their access to the whole world now through the internet. You post your work, and there's just so much talent out there that, like, how do you feel? How do you compete with that? There's so much. Yet you have access to everybody. But then again, everybody has access to everybody. So you're sending your stuff, you're hoping to be seen. And it almost is like you're just as invisible, being one kid from Michigan sending a letter, or a million kids posting their drawings online of like their favorite show, hoping to be seen by the show's creator. But I feel like it's almost like using Photoshop colors. You have millions of colors. And when you've got so many colors, you don't even know who to choose. But if you limit your palette and you choose those colors, somehow that boxing in helps you to be more clear about what you're conveying. And the same here is like, you've got millions of people, but you don't know, how do you box in to like a limited palette of people to
Yeah.
choose from. A lot of these people are just, they're so used to staying at home and drawing they're perfectly happy with that. And a lot of people are perfectly happy making their own things, putting up cartoons online, which boggles my mind, the output of some of these kids daily, how much they actually put into these things.
Right.
And it could just be my old brain going, how do they do it? And then maybe there's software that helps them. I have no idea. But there is maybe a fear when you've got millions of colors that you're completely choosing the wrong palette of colors to choose from. When you can narrow it down, then you can start picking the colors that work best for you, the thing that you're trying to make. There's a Hanna-Barbera palette that I've been trying to get my hands on digitally for Photoshop because it's literally like 120 colors. That's it. But they made millions of cartoons out of just those colors. So I don't know if I'm coming across clear enough, but
No,
when
I
there's
think
so
what you're
many
saying
people,
is,
it's difficult to choose.
yeah, I think what you're saying is the filmmaker needs to sort of nail down who he wants to connect with and get his projects in front of,
Yeah,
and not just throw it out there, which is I think was what YouTube does. It just throws it out there, and you kind of hope it goes viral,
right,
as opposed to being very meticulous about who.
right.
And that's one of the things that Lore, we want to put artists' projects before a dedicated group of audience members,
Mm-hmm.
who if they back it or fund it, like that's good, that's a big deal. And so and so that's yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that should kind of shows the importance of what we're building. But yeah, Jason, you got something?
Yeah, I got one. This is one of the things that I've thought about regularly because I've mentioned your book on 4-panel story structure is really helpful for me on the storytelling side. But if you started just as an artist, just as drawing characters, how did you move to somebody that understood story and was able to produce story consistently and kind of wrangle storytellers into the consistent patterns that it takes for having commercials and that sort of thing?
Well, fortunately, like on, let's say, Dexter's Lab or Powerpuff Girls, those were not scripted shows. They were just outlines. And the outlines were the beginning, the middle, and the end. Like you had some detail. Maybe it was a page, maybe it was two. And we had the freedom, and actually that was our job, to expand on that. Not only did we have to write the gags and the dialogue, but we had to build out that story to actually convey what it was that writer was trying to give us. And you learn really quickly how to some of it's out of cheating. Like, shoot, I don't want to draw that thing. I'm gonna truncate this idea, convey it quickly with this idea, and it does the same thing. So some of it's out of like sheer desire to not have to draw as much. But you start to see how structure works, and you see a pattern emerge, whether you're aware of it or not. There is a pattern. Storytelling is natural, inbred to all of us from day one to now. It's inbred. Some are good at it, some are not good at it, but we all know how a story works. You don't necessarily start a joke with the punchline unless that's part of the joke. Anyway, so
but wait, I have a quick question though. When you say it's not scripted, so like lines were ad-libbed by
the storyboard artist would basically, as they're storyboarding, add the dialogue as the conversation. Okay. So then when the storyboard was finished, that was turned into a recording script. So currently, a lot of shows will be scripted. The Loud House is scripted. And the reason why I chose to be scripted, even though when you're drawing, you discover things that a writer isn't thinking when they're typing or whatever it is they're doing, maybe using a pen, but you discover things through the process of having the characters interact with the world or other characters that a writer might not. A lot of writers, some writers are very good at visualizing, seeing a character come into a room and go, oh, that vase is over there. they should bump into that vase because then this could happen. Like that's something a storyboard artist would discover, a writer might not. So we built our stories visually. So there was less dialogue, more Looney Tunes, visual jokes, gags, etc. And Loud House, because there were 11 characters, I know how easy it is to get a story that says this happens, and you're like, well, I only have to use Lincoln and Lynn because that's what the story says, and then you'll never see the other sisters. And I'm like, well, it is a house full of people, and these people populate this house, and they come in and out of the scenes because they live there. I needed to make sure that everybody was kind of getting equal play, but also that feeling that the world existed outside of that scene. There were things going on in the other rooms. So it had to be scripted. But for Dexter's Lab, Powerpuff Girls, it was like, well, there's only a couple characters. You can't go wrong if the outline says Dexter and Dee Dee get in a fight over a lollipop. That's who's going to be in the scene. You don't have to worry about anybody else. Anyway, to answer your question, that it was an outline-driven show, or what they call board-driven. The storyboard artist, through drawing, developed the story and the dialogue and the gags, which isn't easy. That's a difficult job to do. Storyboarding alone is difficult, but having to come up with dialogue and come up with jokes through the whole thing, man, what a way to cut your teeth. So that's all that meant. There is a script ultimately. It just comes after the storyboarding rather than before the storyboarding.
Okay.
Now I'm off track. Was there a question?
Well, the question was, you ended up landing with kind of a 4-panel structure storytelling wise.
4-act, yeah.
But where did you learn or kind of develop that sense? So you're talking about noticing patterns. Did you have to communicate that regularly with the team? Hey, here's the structure that we're going for, that sort of thing?
Yeah, of course, I shifted. I started getting into shows that were scripted, and you get a sense of how many script pages equal a certain number of minutes in animation. And you'll work with some writers who all they know is words, so they love their words. And you'll get like a 28-page script for an 11-minute show. Like, whoa. Again, this maybe comes out of just not wanting to draw it, but it's like, I'm not going to draw 28 script pages of storyboards because I know half of it's going to be cut. Ultimately, it's about 16 pages tends to work as far as script goes, which, you have to have an argument because they don't want to cut it down. It's like, just draw it and we'll figure out what's cut after. It's like, that's a lot of man hours. There's a lot of drawing. So maybe out of laziness, but it is in that process of getting maybe a 28-page script and going, well, I'm going to cut this thing down to 16. And you start thinking like, how do I convey this 2 pages of dialogue or action into 1/4 page, for example, if I have to cut this many pages out of it, or a whole sequence. And you start to learn, oh, I wrote this thing, but now that I've cut this middle thing out and put these 2 pieces together, I realize I didn't need that at all. The thing that you knew you could not live without is gone, and you don't miss it. So you start thinking like self-editing. And I'm not going to say just through the idea of editing scripts you learn those things. Again, I was fortunate enough to work on shows where I went beyond the storyboarding. I would get into the editing room, and when you've got 13 minutes of footage and the network is dictating that you have to have 10.5 minutes of footage, well, that's 2.5 minutes you've got to cut out, unfortunately. And it starts you thinking like, well, how do we convey these ideas better without losing the information that's coming across? And it just it makes your script writing better when you know further on down the road how it could be edited. So what you do is you edit it out now, where it's easier to hit delete on words than somebody who spent 8 weeks animating and you're cutting out their hard work. So all these things just kind of stay up here. And by the time the Loud House came, and I believe I've said this story before, so I'll try and make it briefer. I wanted it to be a 22-minute show because there were 11 characters in it. I thought it'd be great to have an A story and a B story and maybe a little C and D runner gags or something in it. I started trying to figure out how sitcoms are written. And soon I realized that was going to be too much. But I liked what I learned. And the idea was that the midpoint of a sitcom is like a character makes a decision or something that changes the trajectory of the episode that was surprising. And it was basically just to get people to sit through the commercials. Like, oh, what's going to happen next? I'll wait. That was it. It was like a lure. No pun intended, lure. But I liked that idea. And I also liked the idea of a character, speaking of authenticity, of getting what you want in a big family comes with consequences. And I thought that would be a good theme for the show, is consequences of getting what you want. It's not every episode, but it was a lot of the early ones where I could say the story is A, B, C, and that third act is the kind of the resolution. But what if I compressed that and made the resolution be the midpoint thing that I was learning about with sitcom? And I was like, okay, well, if Lincoln wants ice cream, goes after ice cream, and gets ice cream, well, that's the story. But what if we compress that back and Lincoln wants ice cream, goes after ice cream, gets ice cream, but now has 10 sisters wanting that ice cream? Well, now he's got a dilemma he needs to deal with. So it doubles. You're actually telling two stories in a sense. And I hear often like, wow, how do you get so much story in the Loud House? There were simple stories compressed to the middle, and then think about like through the point of view of a kid. Like, well, you made a decision, you made your bed, now you got to sleep in it. But that's halfway through the cartoon. As a writer now, you've got to write another half of a cartoon and figure out what happens next, which I think was a good challenge. And I didn't mean to put people like in this structural box, but I did feel like you got to set up the idea of the want early on, because again, working on other people's scripts, sometimes you'll be on page 8 and not know what the cartoon is about yet. Like, boy, oh boy, people are going to tune out at this point. So it's like, you got to know what the cartoon's about, what the character's going to do about it, what happens at the midpoint, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and then how that resolves throughout the rest of the cartoon. And it turned into 4 acts because the head writer and I'd be in a writer's room, and they would be like, well, the first half of Act 2 is this, and the second half of Act 2 is that. And I was like, we're speaking too much. Can we all agree that we're going to split Act 2 into 2 parts and just do a 4-act structure? And everyone was like, sure, let's do that. So it literally was. Act 1 was the setup and what the character's going to do. Act 2 was like what we call the meat of the cartoon. If you said the cartoon's about, a character learning to drive, well, that's what I want to see. I want to see that character learning to drive. So that's like the meat of it. Then the midpoint, the win or the fail, and then the decision to take the trajectory elsewhere, that's Act 3. And then Act 4 is like when you're at your lowest and you decide, well, I screwed up. I need to fix this thing. Forget about the ice cream. I'm going to do this thing for my sisters, which ultimately will probably end up in all of us getting ice cream. That's kind of where it came from. And I think everybody felt that the structure wasn't as hindering as they were afraid it was going to be. It was actually liberating to know, like, oh, I don't ever have to, if I'm on page 8 and I'm still in my Act 1, I know where I'm going to have to cut. That's Act 1. Sometimes it's hard to look at a whole script and go like, where do I cut? It actually kind of helps you out. It's just like a little helping hand. And those little signposts along the way really do help. And there are people who don't believe in structure and it's got to be free form, and okay. I never ever said that my way of doing it was the right way or the wrong way, but this is what works for me and this is what works for the show. And I think we knew within like the first few episodes that structure was going to work for us. And then we play with it. That midpoint doesn't have to be a win. It could be a loss. It could be a terrible loss. Going after your thing you want sometimes ends up ruining the day for everybody. Now how do you deal with that? So that's where it really came from. And then the decision to turn it into a book was like, well, maybe I enjoyed reading books that helped me out. Even if you get one nugget out of it, then it's done its job.
Yeah. I love reading on structure, but partly because the difference between no structure and structure in a story, in my experience, is the difference between a bomb and a rocket.
Amen. Yeah.
You might get a lot of excitement out of a bomb, but you don't get very far.
I'm using that.
Okay.
To go the biblical route, you can't build your house on sand. And
Right.
so, I agree
Exactly.
about that.
Right. Well, just some audience questions here for you.
Oh, there's
One,
audience. Holy cow.
there is. What do you think of indie shows, new indie shows like Digital Circus or Smiling Friends?
Oh my gosh.
And,
They're
and there's
challenging my oldness here. Um, Again, like you guys mentioned the idea of like punk rock and how
yeah,
certain types of TV shows or networks, even Adult Swim, MTV, have kind of start from this punk rock foundation. And to me, I'm like, man, I've been in it too long in the, the structured way of doing things. Like I am no longer punk rock. I am more like golden oldies is kind of how I feel. Like those songs had a structure. It was like chorus, chorus, bridge, chorus, or whatever, and a certain number of keys, whatever. I watch those shows and I look at those shows to see what people are doing, and it completely throws everything we've just been talking about away, which proves like there's not one way to do it and not one way to success. And
right.
I marvel at, whether I like those shows or not, I marvel at like what is the thought process from these I'll say kids because they are, I'm old. What is the thought process that they can tell this story in this way and it still feels satisfying when I watch it? And ultimately that's what I want when I watch anything, is to feel satisfied, which, to some degree why some binging doesn't work for me, because we've given the freedom to these writers to not have to satisfy the audience every episode, but just to hook them just enough to watch the next episode. And I feel like, bring me back to the 1980s when every single episode, regardless of a seasonal arc, we had like a payoff, like some feeling of like, oh, that story's finished, but I want to watch more because there's this bigger story. So I look at these cartoons and I marvel at them, and I don't think I could ever write one. I don't think I could ever work on one. And it's not an insecurity. It's just knowing what my capabilities are. And I think there's absolutely room for those cartoons to exist in the same space as the Golden Oldies guy, who still does it by structure. Like there's a familiarity to them. We're in this kind of era right now. You guys have talked a lot about culture and building a culture. Maybe this is a question that's coming up, and sorry if I haven't really answered the question from the person watching, but we're in this era now where a lot of it is fad, and fad is kind of by definition is like disposable. It comes and goes. Everybody wants it for a minute and then it's on to the next thing. And social media and YouTube have given us this notion that our culture is fads, but it really isn't fads. It's made up of fads currently. And culture to me is something that's cultivated. Perhaps that's where the word culture comes from. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's built up over time, and you build a longevity to it, something that withstands the ebbs and flows of fad and remains something that people will continue to go back to, which is why I can watch old cartoons, Rocky and Bullwinkle, because culturally at the time when it was being made, they were tapping into what was going on around them, not in a fad way, but culturally, they were, whether they knew it or not, were injecting the world into their cartoons. We still do it. I do it. And those types of things, if they come from, and I'm going to bring those words back, an honest place and an authentic place, those will remain. A lot of fads come from, oh, this thing is popular now, I'm going to do that. And it just becomes more of the same. There's so many, you go through TikTok or whatever, and it's like the same people doing the same videos because they've been challenged to do their version of it. And it's like, it just gets monotonous and there isn't a uniqueness to it anymore. And I sometimes say it out loud, like, what possessed this person to think that them doing the ice water challenge, I don't know, was any better than the other person doing the ice water challenge? Right. It didn't sit well with me. But when somebody does something that's new and culturally significant, that's the thing that I go, oh, I remember that thing there. Even Angry Cat or Grumpy Cat, he was cultural because it wasn't a fad that was going to come and go that everybody could glom onto. It was one person with this cat they thought was funny, and it's like, I'm going to share this with the world because it came from an authentic place. Look how funny my cat looks. Rest in peace, Grumpy Cat. But you can't set out to be culturally significant. You have to be honest and authentic with what you're doing, and you'll find that audience, whether it's tomorrow or 2 years from now. It will find its place in a cultural way that is significant. And if it goes away, then maybe it was just a fad. I have no idea. I'm sure I've done things that are just fad-like.
It seems like a lot of the entertainment industry is very fad-based and fad-driven right now, and focused on the quick exit. And Jason always says, you can't buy a blockbuster. There's a lot of time and culture cultivating that is required before that happens. Marvel's like 100 years of comic books. It's 2 generations, and
that's a good example.
Yeah, and so no, I think you're absolutely right. But yeah, and
could I say one thing about Grumpy Cat too?
Yeah.
So you can't not talk about him.
No, you can't. But so Grumpy Cat, I was in a punk rock band with the guy who ended up being Grumpy Cat's manager.
Oh.
And he used to, he basically managed our band, and he would come up with crazy marketing ideas, all the way down to we dressed as Pee Wee Herman, and we had, and then he would like go through old things that bands would do in the 60s and find things for us to go do.
Right.
And ended up getting signed because showing up to protest the Christmas party for Sub Pop, got a bunch of people together to protest that Sub Pop hadn't signed us yet.
Man.
and so and that was right. I left the band right before they got signed to Sub Pop, but then he went on to manage Grumpy Cat, and he did this exact same thing where he came up with all sorts of marketing ideas but so even fads that make it are all end up being based on the same kind of basic principles.
Sure.
The punk rock bands that made it that weren't fads were just golden oldies at double speed. It was the same. The Ramones, if you slow the Ramones down, you get you get you don't get the Beatles, but you get 60s music, but you had bands involved there, the Dead Boys, for example, that were just a fad, but they influenced the ones that were doing it on principles that last, principles that affect people, principles that connect people. So I think when it comes down to it, that human connection that you're talking about with the authentic human connection, when somebody really digs in and communicates their humanity well in a story and other people connect to it, those principles are the same no matter the art form, no matter what it is. And those are the sorts of things that you can't get to new exciting versions of that without the experimentation that ends up surrounding what you get when you get one of those great moments.
Yeah, I like that you said lasting principles, because that is exactly what it is. Everything seems so disposable now that you may just flick past the thing that is trying to lay a solid foundation for lasting principles and to build upon. You talk about he's going back to the 60s. I talk about comic strips. I look at ones from the 30s and 40s. We're talking about cartoons, like we're looking at the Looney Tunes. They built a foundation not because it was a passing fad, but because they were trying to culturally be significant and create lasting principles. Not that the Looney Tunes had like principles, they were just gags, but they have a lasting quality about them that you can't pretend isn't there. You can't flick past it if you know it's there.
Well, and I think somebody like Chuck Jones, who turns gags into some sort of next level art form, and you go, how is he doing this to me? Those are dumb gags, and at the same time, there's a level of just high art almost in the way that he draws Bugs Bunny. I mean, I don't know exactly what I'm saying other than
because I'm pretty sure he said it. He never said it's just a dumb kids cartoon. Like he's an adult making something. It's from his heart and it's from his talent. And you're gonna, just like when the executive says we just want to make a good cartoon, it's like, yep, that's right. Chuck Jones wanted to make a good cartoon.
Right.
Yeah. When I was my first children's book, I was working with one of the Big Five an editor for one of the Big Five out in New York, and literally each page he would turn and he would say, "What's this page trying to accomplish?" I'm like, it's 8 to 10 words a page, and I'd have to explain the page to him, and then he would give me phrases. What is this doing here? What is this? And he made every page, he made me explain every phrase. And the rewrite after that, going through the edit of the book that at that level, it was so much better. But I couldn't even imagine how much it could improve because it was a kid's book about hibernating animals.
Right. And I'm sure that was a learning experience. The next time that you did your kid's book, those ideas went through your head and changed the way you approached your next 8 words.
I mean, I think about that all the time. What's this page trying to accomplish? Whenever I do anything now, it's
unfortunately for me, it's like I'm just trying to accomplish you turning the page. That's really where I am. Like, can I leave a drawing at the end of this comic page to make you go, "Oh, I want to turn the page"? But that's just me.
Well, let me ask you this final question before you go, Chris. Why are cartoons so important? Watching cartoons with your kids, or just your kids having cartoons to watch, especially good ones. Why are those? Like, why should people invest in those?
That's a good question. We've touched on it a little bit, where we are adults making these cartoons, and it's not that we're pandering to the kids and like, well, I'm going to write and draw what I think a kid's going to like, but I'm going to write and draw what I like. And if I think it's funny, given a certain amount of like PG rating, if I think it's funny, then I hope someone else thinks it's funny. And it's not that you're only setting out just to please yourself, but that's where it comes from. I'm not writing a joke because I think somebody down the road is going to laugh at it. I think it's funny. If you don't laugh at it, well, that's just a commentary on my taste. Nonetheless, when you are sitting down to watch with your kids, there's a certain amount of them looking up to you. They watch you do the plumbing. They watch you making the dinner. They watch you fixing the car. They watch you vacuuming. And they look up to you physically and mentally. They look up to you. So when you're sitting down with your kids, and as an adult, if I've done my job right, you're enjoying that cartoon too. And you're laughing, and the kid sees dad or mom laughing, and they start to understand this is the thing that we're bonding over. Whether they can articulate that or not, probably not. There is an emotion that's connecting you two. And if we've done our job right, we're creating something outside of cultural significance, but family significance. Mm-hmm. And you're bringing them together with this piece of entertainment or whatever that hopefully, if you've done your job right, does have longevity. Because the cartoons that I watched as a kid, I'm pretty sure my dad was around for that, were the cartoons that I sat down with my kids and watched. And it wasn't because, hey, you're going to think this is funny. It's because they knew dad used to watch this as a kid. And they were like, well, I want to watch this too. I want to see what it is that dad thinks is cool. Not just cartoons, even like Ultraman, for example, which is way outside of like time. Like if I've got my kids in the 2000s and I'm watching Ultraman, which was from the 60s and 70s, that to them is like old. But if they see dad is into it, they're going to be into it. And there's something to be said about creating that bond through the idea of laughter or silly gags, watching characters bump into each other on the screen. Whether we know it as parents or they know it as kids, you're creating a lifelong bond that I don't think any other form of I don't want to say entertainment, but cartoons have a certain amount of levity in them that makes, at least for me, for that moment, you feel like everything's okay. Even if you've had a rough night, the kid was up all night screaming or whatever, when you sit down together, it takes it away. And you go into this world where somebody who was also an adult, who also had problems, who also probably had a rough night, still went to work anyway and made that cartoon for you. It comes through and you enjoy it together. And there's nothing better than enjoying something with a small human, whether adopted or had naturally through birth, that you're connecting with. And it makes the idea of a family clearly the most important thing in our lifetimes.
Yeah. No, it's great. That's great, man.
Can I just ask one final really quick question?
Yeah.
Yep.
Did you know that you had made it when you got to write and direct a Flintstones movie?
You know,
is there? I don't know if there's a higher mark of making it.
You know, we fortunately, working at Hanna-Barbera and working in Warner Brothers, some of the old timers were there. Some of the guys who worked on those shows were there originally, and all you want from them is just like, wow, we saw what you did, and boy, that was great. But I'm not going to name the names, but it was one of the really high up dudes at Hanna-Barbera from the 60s. Asked him straight out, like, oh, what did you think? Why would you want to make that? We already made the Flintstones. And boy, was that just the thing that just put me in my place. I was like, okay, fair enough. You're right. You did already make the Flintstones, and we're just kind of glomming on to what you've already done. It's time for me to create my own thing. But I'll tell you, it was great. Finding the right voices, hearkening back to the earlier designs, the kind of like pre-Pebbles Fred, and updating it was like a total joy. The idea of marital strife, and whether you think so or not, the early 60s Fred versus our Fred, like Wilma was the pants wearer in this Flintstones movie, and we enjoyed putting Fred in his place by modernizing it. So I don't know if I made it. I do know that I was put in my place and understood where I was at that point, but it was fun to make.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us. If you're watching, be sure to subscribe to lore.tv. You can get a free 7-day trial, and you can fund cartoons. We have several cartoons, and just Florida Lee season 2 is going to be fundraising very soon. I think he's working on the trailer for it now. Actually, he posted
cool.
This week, and then Barely Biblical's over 75% now.
Yep.
Almost ready to be funded. You could buy some gold loot and just get it going. It's all your gold loot is 3x because it's in blitz mode, thanks to the Moral T podcast and Renee Leonard Kennedy matching everyone's contribution. And so so that's it. Subscribe to Lore TV if you think cartoons are important and you want cartoons you and your family can enjoy. I would also say subscribe to Lore TV if you want cartoons dads and sons can enjoy. I think that's something that's missed a lot that you brought out, Chris. Like you want your kids to be like dad, and this is the stuff dad laughs at, and this is stuff dad enjoys. Yeah, that's really important. So subscribe to Lore TV, and let's empower artists to make normal cartoons.
Amen.
Radically normal cartoons.
Thanks, guys.
And all right, thanks, guys. We'll be back next week, Thursday. Hope you guys are enjoying the podcast. Please be sure to like and comment. Thank you for the questions in the chat. Be sure to share the episode if you like folklore, and even if you don't like it, spread some hate. It helps engagement.